someone who's been in the field for 25 years, who's, you know, I make my living defending people and in criminal cases. But the point is to avoid all that stuff. Here is my simple rule. Do not treat anyone with HGH unless they have a documented, laboratory-backed deficiency. How much of a deficiency? You can play around with that. Their number's around 120 or something like that. But if you're going to treat this basketball player, or someone that says, look, and someone who comes in and says, look, I hear HGH is good to make you feel better and make you feel younger, and I'm 50 and I'm in perfect health, and by the way, I've had my labs done, and they're normal or high normal, but I want that extra edge. That is a problem under federal law as it exists. It will not be a problem if Kevin wins his lawsuit. Until that time, someone who does that is called a potential target, and a potential target of a federal felony criminal case. It is wonderful that Kevin won this case for Jim Forsythe, but at least as I understand it, Jim had documentation in every medical chart of a deficiency of human growth hormone. Isn't that true? Every chart, he had a deficiency, a documented deficiency, and I think that's what really made it legal, because what the feds don't want to do is get into a morass about is 120 the number or 80 or something, you know, and then have experts doing it. But that's what he had. So in my opinion as a counselor, if you want to avoid federal DEA scrutiny, FDA scrutiny on this issue, don't do it unless you have documentation of a deficiency or wasting syndrome. Very simple. If you follow my advice, look, you never know what's going to happen. Anybody can, your competitor can come in, but at least if you follow my advice, when the feds come in or the boards come in for giving non-therapeutic use of a drug, you have a defense, you have the documentation in there, and there'll be any number of people in this forum, the people around you, that will be able to come and defend what you're doing. And that, at least from the feds' point of view, that will be enough. State boards you still might have an issue because, as one of the commenters, one of the questioners said before, the people that the board is going to ask are the folks that say you should never give it unless some extreme case, right? But
they also define the deficiency.
What?
Those same people define what a deficiency.
Correct, and it's an extremely conservative definition. It's a definition that most of you would not agree to. I got that. So you may have a board issue there, and the problem with the board issue, I do a lot of licensing work too, and the problem with the boards are they tend to rely on experts like what you were talking about. Then you come in with your experts. The boards are they're not the super doctors, they're the politicians who tend to rely on conventional medicine. They rule against you, and judges don't basically listen to appeals about standard of care issues. They're not going to weigh evidence. Under the standard of what's called substantial evidence, they don't get involved in that. So, if there's a scintilla of evidence in favor of the board, they win. The only thing you really win on appeals and licensing cases are procedural issues, like where they're not going on rules. So it's a little more complicated in board actions, but if you have that documentation, that lab finding of a deficiency, that is eminently defensible. And I would say on that situation, you go with God. Look, in my view, well, it's not my view. In point of fact, the federal government regulates drugs up the wazoo. Anywhere from medical marijuana, Schedule 1, no use. Schedule 2, they require you to have triplicates. Schedule 3, Schedule 4, that's what the schedules are. So, technically, they do have the power to regulate drugs. Interestingly, HGH, I believe, is the only drug that you can't use off-label. Every other drug you can use off-label, as you well know, cancer chemotherapy, SSRIs, all that stuff, all the drugs basically are used off-label 30, 40, 50% of the time. HGH is the only drug where that is not permissible. Is it constitutional? I'm going to go out on a limb. I've been doing this a long time, and I've been trying to get a Freedom of Rights bill. The patients have access to experimental treatment for 25 years. It worked last week with Denny Crane, but at least for me, I've been knocking my head against the wall for a very long time. If we couldn't get that right in Rutherford in 1979 with Laetrile, when you had some of the great liberal stalwarts of the Supreme Court on the bench, and we lost 9-0 in an opinion written by, the most liberal judge on the court then, I think the chances of having a right to access to treatment or holding that a statute is unconstitutional because it restricts HGH to certain specified use. I can say I'm praying for it, but I'm not holding my breath, and I don't think you ought to have your prescribing practices based on that lawsuit or aspirations like that. In my opinion, the Supreme Court is not one now for creating rights unless it has to do with guns. So as one of the characters in Boston Legal said just last week. So I think that's a long shot. I think the court could well look at the statute. It's clear on its face what it says, and I just can't see what the constitutional right is. We just haven't been able to get a declaration that people have a right to experimental treatments, yet something as narrow as, let alone something as narrow as a particular use of a treatment. So if it happens, like I say, we're all going to, we're going to do pilgrimages to Kevin's office. I'm going to be head of the thing. But it's just something that I think you shouldn't base your prescribing practices on. So, are there any questions about HGH, at least in terms of that's my view and the practicalities of it? Yes.
Well, there's a kind of a developing kind of workaround where people are using either direct, like the stimulator of growth hormone, not growth hormone itself, in other words, to evade the whole idea of controlling HGH. Now,
even better. If it's not called HGH and there's no statute. So working around HGH, some precursor molecule or something like that, or a stimulator?
The precursor hormone that stimulates the pituitary to heath.
Good. It's not in the statute, is it? It's not called HGH.
I'm just
If it's not HGH, then it's not part. That's it. Statute's read narrowly. The only thing this bugger says is you can't, use HGH. Anything else you can do. It's a free country, as long as the drug is approved for some other use. If it's not, then we deal with issues which I'll talk about bioidentical hormones.